Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no mercy. There is no forgiveness. And yet, in a moment thick with despair and damnation, a single space marine stood between total annihilation and something far worse. When players first confronted the final moments of Space Marine, many believed the conclusion to be a triumph, a hard-won battle against the forces of chaos, an end that saved a world from the cleansing wrath of Exterminatus. But the truth, buried under layers of imperial doctrine, inquisitorial silence, and the corrupted echoes of the warp, is far more complex. Captain Titus didn't merely prevent a planet from burning. He may have stopped a catastrophe that could have unraveled the fragile fabric of the Imperium itself. To understand what Titus really prevented, we have to move beyond the bombastic final fight, beyond the cinematic sacrifice and martial valor. We have to dissect the beating heart of Warhammer 40,000's universe, the horrifying logic of the Exterminatus order, and the unthinkable consequences of what lay just beneath Forge World Graia's besieged surface. Titus was more than a hero. He was a fulcrum, and the blade he held balanced the survival of a world against the temptation of a god. Exterminatus is not a threat. It is not a warning. It is an absolute, an ending so final, so merciless, that even the warp recoils at its invocation. When the High Lords of Terra authorize Exterminatus, they are not simply eliminating a tactical liability. They are obliterating an entire planetary existence. Billions of lives, ecosystems, histories, even the soil itself, reduced to ash or rendered uninhabitable for millennia. It is the Imperium's final solution to uncontainable heresy, Xenos infestation, or demonic incursion. And yet, it is not a clean or clinical process. It is an act of despair wrapped in fire and radiation. It is the weaponized acknowledgement that a world and everything upon it is beyond salvation. For those who have never stood on the precipice of an Exterminatus order, it may be difficult to comprehend its symbolic significance. In the eyes of the Imperium, a world is sacred only so long as it remains useful, compliant, or uncontaminated. The moment it ceases to serve, or worse, becomes a threat to the wider Imperium, it is deemed expendable. But that cold logic belies the emotional devastation it leaves behind. Every Forge world burned is not just a tactical blow, it is a wound to the collective memory of humanity, a cultural extinction. With every hive that falls under cyclonic torpedoes, a billion prayers are cut short mid-syllable, their echoes smothered by atomic winds. And when it comes to a planet like Graia, this reality weighs heavier. This was not some outpost on the fringes, not an agri-world with minimal strategic value. Graia was a Forge world, a bastion of Mars Mechanicum legacy, a place where titanic machines were born and where the Emperor's will was manifested through industry and fire. To destroy Graia would not simply be to remove a blighted infection. It would be akin to burning a library of sacred knowledge, volumes etched into servitor minds, manufacturing templates held in the cogitator hearts of tech priests, secrets whispered from one iron priest to another, under the red-lit eyes of Omnissiah shrines. Exterminatus here would be not just annihilation, it would be sacrilege. There is also the terrifying truth that Exterminatus is rarely enacted in isolation. It is a statement to the wider sector. It broadcasts fear as much as it does policy. The destruction of a world warns others not to fall. It says, you are one infection away from oblivion. It is the ultimate coercive doctrine, and it must be handled with a calculated, pitiless hand. That's why it is so often the tool of the Inquisition, the most secretive, paranoid, and morally ambiguous force in the entire Imperium. To authorize Exterminatus is to weigh infinite souls against unknown consequences, and to choose fire. But Exterminatus also breeds silence. Records are scrubbed, survivors are not permitted. Even in the rare cases where the populace is forewarned, evacuation is reserved for the most vital personnel, senior mechanicus, valuable psychers, inquisitorial agents. For the common citizen, the serf, the soldier, there is only the sky falling in. Entire generations are reduced to whispers. Maps are redrawn. 1,000 years later, and sometimes all that remains is a blank spot on the star charts, a forbidden coordinate, a name spoken only by the damned. So when Inquisitor Thrax considered invoking Exterminatus on Graia, it was not done lightly, but it was considered. The threat of chaos contamination is, after all, the most dangerous of all. Where orcs destroy, chaos corrupts. Where greenskins rend the body, the warp devours the soul. Once daemons have set foot on a world, that planet is no longer trusted. Its every stone is suspect. Its very air might be a vector for corruption. Under such circumstances, Exterminatus is not just a possibility, it becomes doctrine. And yet, what if there's a sliver of hope? What if a single figure, perhaps anomalous, perhaps defiant of fate, stands in that crucial moment and tips the balance? This is where the heroism of someone like Titus becomes not just relevant, but pivotal. Because the Exterminatus order looms not just as a possibility, but as the inevitable conclusion to failure. Every breath taken after that decision is stayed, is a borrowed one. Every hour the planet remains whole is a fragile defiance against the tide. Titus, by confronting the true threat and buying even moments of clarity, created the narrowest sliver of possibility, one where fire did not rain from the sky. But that delay was not a gift. It was a challenge, a test. Because the Imperium does not hesitate forever. If the warp corruption proved too deep, if the Orc remnants rallied again, or if even a single Inquisitor deemed the effort unsalvageable, Graia would have been cleansed without hesitation. In that sense, Exterminatus is the ever-present shadow. It is not simply the end of a failed defense, it is the fail-safe of a paranoid empire. To prevent Exterminatus is to win more than a battle. It is to temporarily stay the hand of a god that sees fire as mercy. Graia was not just a forge world. It was a linchpin, a vital cog in the Imperium's war machine, a world whose industrial heartbeat pulsed with the energy of 100,000 manufactoria. Titans were not just maintained here, they were born. The colossal reactor cores beneath the crust powered assembly lines that forged baneblades, plasma weaponry, and the mechanical sinews of the Adeptus Mechanicus's armored wrath. Destroying Graia wouldn't have been a surgical strike, it would have been akin to gutting a god. The strategic value of Graia cannot be overstated. It wasn't simply producing weapons, it was producing culture, doctrine, and stability in a region of space constantly flirting with rebellion or worse. Mechanicus worlds like Graia serve as anchors in Imperial logistics, waystations for fleet refueling, refit centers for battered crusades, and sacred hubs where ancient STCs are guarded, like the Emperor's own heartbeat. Exterminatus here would have done more than burn a world. It would have broken supply chains, choked the front lines, and left nearby sectors fatally exposed. And this wasn't lost on the Orcs. Their invasion wasn't a blind rampage, it was strategic, suspiciously so. Orcs normally swarm toward violence for the sheer joy of battle, but this attack had a strange coordination, a purposefulness. They struck not just with overwhelming force, but with direction, seizing vital production hubs and defending them with zealous tenacity. The greenskins understood, at least instinctively, that Graia was more than just another battlefield. It was a treasure to be seized, a machine to be broken and rebuilt in the image of Gork and Mork. This is where the looming specter of Exterminatus takes on an even darker hue. Because to consider the annihilation of Graia was to consider sacrificing an irreplaceable node in the Imperium's technological lattice. For every Mars, there are a dozen Graias, less hallowed, but no less essential. The destruction of one sends shockwaves through subsectors, overburdening other forge worlds, starving campaigns of materiel, slowing down entire crusades. It is the grim calculus of the Imperium. Kill a planet to save 10 others, but in doing so, cripple your ability to fight tomorrow's war. There's also the political dimension. Graia's Mechanicus hierarchy would not have gone quietly into that nuclear night. The Adeptus Mechanicus, though nominally loyal to the Imperium, are fiercely independent when it comes to their domains. The idea that an Inquisitor, even with the highest authority, would destroy a forge world without severe consequence is laughable. Magi of Graia would have dispatched encrypted astropathic protests, demanded justification, and perhaps even threatened techno-heresy. A wrong move here wouldn't just end a world, it could trigger an internal schism. Moreover, Graia's sacred function gave the Imperium something it so rarely has: hope. Hope that the Titan Legion stationed there would turn the tide. Hope that the production lines could be resecured and reactivated. Hope that victory, no matter how Pyrrhic, would leave something to salvage. And that hope carried weight, not just to Inquisitors and generals, but to the lowliest guardsmen, the most devout tech adept. For them, Graia wasn't just home. It was proof that the machine god still watched over man. Yet hope is fragile, and even as it pulsed beneath the crust of Graia in glowing rivers of magma-fed power, it flickered. The longer the war dragged on, the more that hope dimmed. The orc siege bled the defenders dry. Every manufactorum that fell echoed like a bell tolling doom. Every lost reactor, every corrupted cogitator, every desecrated temple of the Omnissiah brought Exterminatus one step closer, not just as an act of military necessity, but as a desperate act of containment. That is the tragedy of strategic importance in the Imperium. It makes you too valuable to abandon and too dangerous to let fall. The more vital you are, the more likely it is that you will be sacrificed at the first sign of true corruption. And with chaos blooming behind the green tide like a hidden cancer, the risk became not just hypothetical, it became doctrinal. Had Graia fallen fully to the warp, the Imperium would not have hesitated. The entire region would have been destabilized. Warp storms would have bled outward, contaminating nearby systems. The schematics and technology contained within its data vaults could not be allowed to fall into heretical hands. Better to lose it all in flame than risk its perversion. That is the logic of Exterminatus. That is the cruel balance of strategic necessity. So when Titus fought, not just against orcs but against time itself, he fought for more than survival. He fought to preserve a cornerstone of imperial function, a cathedral of iron and flame upon which whole campaigns rested. To fail was not to die. It was to set in motion a cascade of ruin that the Imperium could ill afford. Every minute gained was another breath for the galaxy. Every victory was another tick delaying the apocalypse. The invasion of Graia by the orcs was more than the typical chaos of a WoG. It was a thunderous display of brutality and mass, yes, but beneath the avalanche of green muscle and scrap metal war machines, there was something unnervingly deliberate. Orcs, by their very nature, are anarchic, driven by instinct, the promise of battle, and the endless psychic echo of their species' warlust. But on Graia, they behaved differently. Their strikes were not only forceful, they were focused. Critical infrastructure was targeted early. Power stations, manufactoria, and even orbital defense systems fell with ruthless efficiency. It was as if someone or something had shaped the savagery into a scalpel. This is the first hint of something darker threading through the green tide. Orcs are rarely this coordinated unless driven by an unusually intelligent war boss or subtly guided by an outside force. The war boss Grimskull was large, cunning, and fiercely ambitious, but not inhumanly brilliant. His siege tactics bordered on genius, not by orc standards, but by any military standard. He had his boys strike at vulnerable points, hold key positions with an iron grip, and even repurpose Graia's own defenses against its inhabitants. It was a blitzkrieg of crude genius, but it wasn't just tactics that disturbed the defenders. It was the sheer scale. Billions of orcs descended upon Graia. Not tens of millions. Billions. From orbit, it must have looked like the world was turning green. Their rocks punched through orbital platforms like falling moons. Their scrap-laden hulks carried megatons of war gear, grot laborers, squigs, and an entire industrial ecosystem of manufacturing. The very surface of Graia began to transform, reshaped by crude orc machinery and crude ambition. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a contest of ideologies, a war between mechanical sanctity and improvisational entropy. But there was something else, something more insidious. The orcs began to appear in places they had no right to be. Vaults deep beneath the manufactoria, sanctums sealed for millennia, databanks protected by Mechanicus code prayers. They were breached. Not just once, but repeatedly. And when Imperial counteroffensives struck back, they found orcs holding positions with uncharacteristic patience, as if guarding more than territory. As if waiting. The guardsmen and Skitari who fought in the tunnels beneath Graia reported strange sights. Warp light flickering where it should not be. Sudden madness among Vox operators. Entire squads vanishing into corridors that were mapped as dead ends. Orcs weren't doing this. They couldn't, but they were present. And they were acting as if something had promised them a greater reward than just the fight. That kind of behavior among greenskins is almost unheard of. They are not bargainers. They do not strike pacts. Unless something whispered to them in a way even they could understand. Even the loudest WoG can carry echoes. The brutality, of course, was unimaginable. orcs do not just kill, they desecrate. They turn sacred machinery into toys and temples into engine bays. They paint glyphs of Gork and Mork across cogitators, tear open servo skulls to make crude decorations, and laugh as they stomp on centuries of progress. But on Graia, the desecration was more targeted. Titan construction yards were captured early. The largest plasma reactors were rigged for explosion, but the orcs didn't detonate them. They kept them alive, powered them, used them. This allowed the invasion to stretch far longer than most planetary sieges. Graia's defenders were not just battling orcs. They were battling fatigue, despair, and the growing realization that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this invasion. It wasn't just the scale or the violence. It was the feeling that the orcs were the opening act, that they were here to shatter the defenses so something far worse could crawl through. When you look at the horror Graia endured, it's easy to assume the Exterminatus order was being whispered about behind sealed doors from the very first week. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood of a heretical outbreak. Every dead tech priest raised the specter of forbidden knowledge falling into enemy hands, and the orcs, by accident or by design, were ensuring that those horrors had space to take root. Titus fought them as only an ultramarine could, precise, brutal, unrelenting. But even he must have sensed it. These were not the orcs he had fought before. They were swarming toward something. Not just victory. Not just a fortress. Something beneath. Something old. Something that had waited for the cover of a wag to be awakened. This was the scale of what was unfolding. Not merely a battle for survival, but a perfect storm of destruction and corruption. And the orcs, usually the storm itself, had become the bait. The green vanguard of something far more terrifying. And the question no one dared ask was this. What if the Exterminatus wasn't meant to stop the orcs? What if it was meant to prevent what they were unwittingly digging toward? Chaos does not crash through the front door. It seeps through cracks in the foundation, coils through the hidden places, and whispers to those who would listen, and even to those who would not. On Graia, as the orcs dominated the skies and streets, a far subtler war was unfolding beneath the surface. The signs were there for those who knew where to look. The strange quiet between assaults, the sudden coordination in orc behavior, the maddening aura that clung to once holy places of the Mechanicus. These were not the marks of green-skinned conquest. They were the spore of chaos. The real war for Graia began not with the orcs, but with the veil thinning. It is difficult to grasp the full horror of Chaos's involvement in the invasion without understanding the bait-and-switch nature of warp corruption. Chaos does not need to win a war. It only needs to plant seeds. And through the chaos of war, capital and lowercase, it thrives. Blood rituals conducted in secret, sigils scrawled in sacred cogitator ink, forbidden chants buried beneath vox static. All of these began to surface in scattered reports from the front lines. Mechanicus adepts began to suffer mental fractures, their logic engines overwhelmed by images that should not exist. Servitors went rogue. Data vaults began corrupting in identical patterns across multiple facilities. The signs were impossible to ignore, yet too subtle to confirm. Then came the daemons. Not with a thunderclap, not with a spectacle. They bled into reality, phasing through the weakened membrane of real space like oil through silk. At first, they were glimpsed only in peripheral vision. Shadow things flitting between columns, voices heard without source. Guardsmen opened fire on nothing and fell screaming to things unseen. Entire squads were found dismembered, with no signs of forced entry. Mechanicus picked recordings failed to replay what they had captured. And then, finally, Nemeroth showed his hand. The Chaos Lord did not burst into the narrative. He emerged, as all true threats of the warp do, with inevitability. His voice came through corrupted vox channels long before he was seen. His presence was a slow poison, sickening the defenders' morale, fracturing their discipline. When he finally appeared, it was not as a commander, but as a prophet. He came not just to win. He came to ascend. This is what the orcs had been breaking the world open for. Not gold, not glory, not conquest. They were the hammer to shatter the Imperium's armor, to pave the way for the ritual to begin. Nemeroth's presence shifted the entire strategic calculus. Suddenly, the defenders weren't just trying to hold a forge world, they were trying to stop a warp breach. A full-scale demonic incursion, if completed, would mean the end of Graia and possibly the entire subsector. Planets connected by trade, diplomacy, or shared defense networks would be tainted by association, destabilized by the echo of the breach. Once daemons walk freely, they do not stop at borders. The implications for Exterminatus became not merely likely, but mandatory. At that point, the calculus shifted from defending Graia to containing it. If Nemeroth succeeded in opening a stable warp rift, it wouldn't matter what the orcs did. It wouldn't matter how many Titans stood. The order would be given, and cyclonic torpedoes would end it all. Titus saw this with a clarity that few others could. Perhaps it was his ultramarine training. Perhaps it was something deeper, something within him that resonated differently with the warp. But he moved decisively. He hunted not just the physical threats, but the source. He went into the heart of the taint, faced down the architect of the incursion. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that once the threshold was crossed, no salvation would be possible. He would not simply defeat a Chaos Lord. He would prevent a new Eye of Terror from opening on Graia's surface. What makes Nemeroth's threat so terrifying is not just his power, but his timing. He chose the moment when Imperial forces were at their weakest, when the Defenders' attention was wholly consumed by the orcs, when the Mechanicus were too distracted to sense their shrines being twisted from within. He chose the moment when faith in the Emperor was ebbing under the endless tide of war. It is in such moments that chaos finds its truest strength. And yet, it is important to understand that Nemeroth was not simply trying to destroy. He was trying to create. His ritual was designed to remake him, to elevate him beyond the chains of mortality and into the ranks of the demon princes. That process is not surgical, it is explosive. It warps reality itself. If completed, Graia would not have remained a planet. It would have become a portal, alive, screaming, and impossible to close without total destruction. The scale of this potential cataclysm dwarfs even the devastation of Exterminatus. Where Exterminatus ends life, Ascension reshapes it, twists it into mockeries of flesh and steel, logic and madness. Titus, knowingly or not, averted this with every step he took toward the final confrontation. Every inch of ground reclaimed was not just territory, it was stolen time, disrupted ritual, defiance incarnate. So when we speak of what Exterminatus might have prevented, we must also speak of what Titus did prevent. Because if Nemeroth had succeeded, there wouldn't have been a planet left to cleanse. There would have been only an open wound in the galaxy. A new daemon world born in the belly of the Mechanicus' pride. A forge of unmaking. A shrine to damnation. And from it, who knows what nightmares would have poured. Titus was never handed control over the fate of Graia. He seized it, moment by desperate moment, from the jaws of inevitability. The calculus of Exterminatus was not abstract during the battle. It was a live current running through every command channel. A quiet breath behind every order issued by Imperial command. Time was the enemy as much as the orcs or the warp. And Captain Titus, with no authority to overrule an Inquisitor or Mechanicus Magos, nevertheless shifted the course of fate by making the right decisions at the right time. There is no centralized clock for when Exterminatus becomes viable. It's not a countdown, but a cumulative weight, a tipping point of lost ground, corrupted sanctums, and slain T personnel. Graia was teetering. Had Titus moved slower, had he paused to consolidate, had he shown even the smallest delay in pushing toward the source of the warp contamination, it's likely the order would have been signed and sealed. This wasn't just about defeating the enemy, it was about preserving the illusion that the situation was still recoverable. And illusions matter. In a galaxy run by bureaucracy, belief in possibility is a vital resource. Inquisitors do not launch Exterminatus because they want to. They do it because they no longer believe. And belief is often swayed by perception. What Titus gave the Imperium, by his relentless advance, was a narrative of defiance. A reportable, transmissible sequence of events that suggested just barely that victory might still be possible. That somewhere in the smoke and blood, the enemy was losing ground. Timing, here, becomes everything. When Titus and his squad pushed beyond the ruins and into the deeper Manufactoria, it sent signals, literal and metaphorical. Sensor readings began to shift, data feeds stabilized, surviving Vox units began to broadcast success rather than silence. Each small win was another delay on the doomsday clock. And that delay mattered more than anything, because the order of Exterminatus, once given, is irreversible. A cyclonic torpedo strike is not deployed with hesitation. Once the payloads are primed, they are fired. The authorization may be questioned later, the records sealed in the vaults of the Ordo Hereticus, but the planet will still burn. Titus's every action in those final hours of the siege carried the burden of all that potential fire. Consider the key targets he neutralized: warp portals forming in critical production centers, enemy command structures that coordinated both Orc and Chaos forces, and corrupted Mechanicus shrines that could have served as anchors for demonic infestation. Each one of these was a strategic tipping point. Any one of them falling into Chaos control for too long might have pushed Inquisitor Thrax over the edge. But each one that Titus reclaimed gave the High Command another reason to stay their hand. And yet, the most remarkable element of this dance is that Titus never knew how close he came. He fought with the courage of conviction, not the fear of consequence. This is the paradox of heroism in the Imperium. You often save the galaxy without knowing it. There was no dramatic transmission announcing, "You have delayed Exterminatus." There was no visible line crossed. But in that quiet chamber aboard an inquisitorial vessel, someone recalibrated a probability matrix, hesitated over a button, and chose to wait just one more hour. That hour was earned in blood. And in those minutes, Titus did what entire regiments could not. He reversed the spiritual momentum of a planetary war. He made the defenders believe again. He made the bureaucrats pause, and perhaps most importantly, he gave the Inquisitor a reason to justify inaction. In the logic of the Imperium, this is sometimes the greatest miracle of all. But miracles alone are not enough. They must be timed with precision. Titus didn't have the authority to order fleets or command orbital bombardments. What he had was judgment. The judgment to press forward when others would retreat. The judgment to go alone where others would wait for reinforcements. The judgment to sacrifice positional security in order to strike at the heart of the enemy. This judgment is what separated him from the commanders who fail in moments of crisis. The galaxy is filled with brilliant strategists who were too late, too cautious, too unsure. Titus made calls that, had they failed, would have been labeled reckless. But they succeeded. And because of that, Exterminatus remained a threat, not a reality. To delay Exterminatus is to give humanity a future, even if only for a day. Titus gave them more than that. He gave the Imperium time to think, to consider, to hope. In a machine that functions through inertia, his actions were friction. And sometimes, a little friction is all it takes to stop the final hammer from falling. Inquisitor Thrax did not arrive on Graia as a savior. He arrived as an arbiter of annihilation, a figure cloaked in the authority to erase entire civilizations with a word. The Inquisition is not the hand of mercy. It is the scalpel used when the Imperium's rot spreads too far. Thrax embodied this principle with terrifying precision. His presence alone was a herald of possible doom, and though he walked among allies, he did so with the cold detachment of someone who might be forced to destroy them. In many ways, his arrival was the moment the question of Exterminatus shifted from theoretical to probable. The Inquisition is divided into Ordos, each tasked with hunting a different flavor of damnation. Thrax was of the Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters. His specialty was the warp, the unseen, the corruptive. He did not come to Graia because of the orcs. He came because of the whispers. The reports of strange occurrences, the rumors of ancient artifacts stirred from slumber, the unsettling synchronicity of the invasion. All signs pointed to chaos. And when chaos is confirmed, the Ordo Malleus is empowered to make decisions that override even sector command. Thrax's demeanor from the moment he steps onto the battlefield is instructive. He does not fight, he observes, he does not encourage, he interrogates. His presence is an unspoken threat, a walking reminder that should the defenders fail, their world will not be mourned, it will be silenced. And this attitude is not villainy, it is the stark reality of his purpose. The Inquisition must be willing to sacrifice the few for the many. In Thrax's mind, Graia was already half dead. It was on Titus and his allies to prove otherwise, and that burden of proof was insurmountable. How does one prove a planet is worth saving when it's already bleeding corruption? How does one convince a man trained to see heresy in every shadow that the darkness hasn't already won? Thrax was not merely assessing the enemy, he was assessing the defenders, looking for signs of taint, hesitation, ideological weakness. Because to the Inquisition, failure of morale is as dangerous as failure of arms. This is why Titus's resistance to the warp became suspect. He did not behave like a standard Astartes. He did not recoil in horror from warp anomalies. He walked through them, endured them, even seemed unchanged. To a mind like Thrax's, this was not heroism. It was a red flag. Strength without corruption is nearly impossible in the Imperium's logic. Those who resist the warp too well are either lying or already claimed. So even as Titus was fighting to save the world, Thrax was preparing to destroy it. Every action was measured, not just for effectiveness, but for ideological purity. The loss of the Codex, the irregular tactics, the refusal to stand down when ordered, all of these were added to a mental dossier. And what makes this so chilling is that Thrax was not wrong. He wasn't a villain twisting the truth. He was operating from centuries of bitter precedent. Worlds have been lost before because someone looked clean, but wasn't. At no point does Thrax signal that he believes salvation is possible. He is always cold, always ready. When he interacts with Titus, there is no camaraderie, no respect, only suspicion. And while this might feel unjust, it is a truth of the setting. The Inquisition was not made to protect heroes. It was made to prevent tragedy at any cost. Yet, Thrax doesn't give the order. That silence is damning in itself. It means that something stayed his hand. Maybe it was the undeniable results of Titus's crusade. Maybe it was the sheer improbability of his victories. Or maybe it was fear. Fear that Exterminatus might not be enough. Because once daemons walk, once rituals are begun, even fire might fail to cleanse. And if Thrax hesitated for even a second, it wasn't because he had hope. It was because he wasn't sure he had enough torpedoes. That is the paradox of the Malleus. They wield power immense enough to burn planets, yet they fear what lies beneath the soil. Thrax was a man standing at the threshold of that fear, calculating risk in real time, and watching Titus do the impossible. And for just long enough, that impossibility kept the fires at bay. But what haunts this moment, what makes it so resonant, is the uncertainty of Thrax's silence. Did he choose to spare Graia? Or did he simply wait too long to decide? Did Titus win the war, or merely outpace the bureaucracy of death? The answer is never given, because the Inquisition does not answer. It observes, judges, and then disappears, leaving only speculation and scars. In this ambiguity lies the genius of the narrative. Titus fought not just against enemies, but against the slow, grinding doom of policy. Thrax was the personification of that doom, a blade hovering, never quite falling, and though it stayed aloft, it never vanished. Even in victory, its shadow remains, in the heart of Graia's desecrated forge, buried beneath layers of corrupted steel and ancient Mechanicus secrets, pulsed a device unlike any other, a chaos warp engine, both a beacon and a weapon. It was not merely a conduit for energy, it was a key, a device designed to tear open reality itself, to allow the immaterium to bleed through the veil and reshape the physical world in its image. Titus's pursuit of this engine and his relentless drive to neutralize it was not just heroism, it was salvation. Warp engines of this nature are not common. They are rare artifacts of heretical brilliance, forbidden technologies whispered of in the darker corners of the galaxy. Unlike a simple summoning ritual, which opens a temporary breach to pull demons into real space, a warp engine sustains a rupture. It anchors the warp tear and expands it, stabilizing it until it becomes permanent. Such a device, once activated and fueled, could transform an entire region of space into a demonic domain. The Mechanicus do not dream of such things. They fear them, because the warp, once stabilized, begins to consume logic and form. Machines fail, time unravels, language ceases to function. The very laws of physics are rewritten according to the whims of dark gods. A warp engine is not a bomb, it is a seed, and what it grows is madness. This is what Titus was up against. Nemeroth's plan was not to destroy Graia. It was to transcend it, to take the raw materials of faith, steel, and suffering and forge a new reality, a world bound to his will, where he would rise not as conqueror, but as God. The warp engine at the center of his scheme was to be the altar of his apotheosis, Powered by the stolen energies of the Forge world, anchored by rituals inscribed in blood and data, it would open the path to daemonhood. And it nearly worked. The engine was partially active. The signs were unmistakable. The distortion of space, the flickering of voices not spoken, the warping of matter in the surrounding structures, arches melting like wax, cogitators bleeding static like open wounds. These were not symbolic signs, they were literal warnings. The engine had begun to sing. Had it reached full activation, the consequences would have rippled outward in concentric rings of corruption. First, the facility itself would have become a demon world nucleus. Then, the surrounding cities, already weakened by orc invasion, would fall in hours. Within days, the warp bleed would reach planetary scale. And within weeks, the rift might become permanent. A new eye of terror, a second maelstrom, anchored not in deep space, but in the very heart of the Imperium's industrial infrastructure. Titus's actions in this moment cannot be overstated. By locating and disrupting the engine, he didn't just interrupt Nemeroth's ascension. He severed the very mechanism that would have guaranteed Exterminatus, because once such a device reaches critical mass, it becomes the final argument for planetary sterilization. No force, no doctrine, no amount of strategic value can outweigh the threat of a permanent warp breach. Fire becomes the only answer. But here's the subtle tragedy. No one else truly understood what he prevented. The Inquisition suspected, the Mechanicus perhaps theorized, but Titus saw it. He walked the broken corridors, he heard the machine whisper, he stood in its glow and felt the way reality bent in its presence. He did not just destroy it, he wrestled the soul of the planet back from the jaws of the warp. This device was not some corrupted Mechanicus engine or Xenos technology repurposed. It was a work of chaos, a thing born from belief, sacrifice, and psychic will. Its gears turned with hatred, its circuits ran on sorrow. To dismantle it was not just an act of physical destruction, it was a spiritual confrontation, and Titus, whether aware or not, became a conduit for resistance, a beacon of order in a place being rewritten by madness. And yet, there is no monument to this moment. No shrine, no record in the Librarius. Because to acknowledge what he did would be to admit how close the Imperium came to oblivion. The Exterminatus order hovered not merely because of the orcs or the demons, but because of this. The warp engine was the deciding factor. It was the heart of the infection, and its destruction was the only act that truly removed the justification for planetary extinction. Had it been allowed to pulse for even a few more hours, its presence might have tipped the balance. The Inquisition, sensing the crescendo, would have acted. The order would have been given. And Titus, had he succeeded even a moment too late, would have saved nothing. So when we ask what Titus prevented, we must not speak only in terms of battles won or foes defeated. We must speak in the language of containment, of timelines that never happened. Of futures burned before they could be born. The warp engine was a womb for catastrophe, and he aborted it before it could scream. In the silence that followed, the world did not cheer. It merely endured. And sometimes that is the greatest victory of all. The defense of Graia did not come cheaply. It was paid for in oceans of blood and the pulverized bones of the Astra Militarum. The Imperial Guard, those countless millions of unremarkable men and women, became the flesh and blood dam that held back annihilation, if only for a little while. And in that time they bought, perhaps unknowingly, they forestalled Exterminatus itself. Their sacrifice was not glorified, nor was it remembered. But it was pivotal. Without their suffering, there would have been nothing left for Titus to save. Across the shattered districts of Graia's forge hives, the Guard died in the tens of millions. Bayonet charges into orc choke points, last stands in flooded manufactoria, endless patrols through demon-haunted ruins. These were not the actions of victors, but of shields. They were holding actions, delaying actions. Every life lost was a message to High Command. We are still fighting. And as long as someone fought, Exterminatus remained just slightly less inevitable. This is the paradox of the Guard. They are expendable, yes, but they are also the metric by which the Imperium measures hope. If the Guard fights, then the world is not yet lost. If regiments continue to report in, if officers maintain discipline, if even a single outpost can broadcast defiance, then someone at the top, perhaps even an Inquisitor, can argue that the situation is salvageable. It's a grim kind of accounting. But it is real. On Graia, guard commanders issued those desperate reports with pride sharpened into defiance. Entire companies were reduced to platoons, then squads, then fire teams, and still they resisted. Logistics collapsed, reinforcements never came, and medical supplies ran dry. But they held, and they transmitted. Those Vox signals were as much a lifeline as any bolter, because they proved that chaos had not yet won. They proved that Exterminatus would be premature. This dynamic is central to understanding what Titus inherited. By the time he intervened, the Guard had already turned the planet into a meat grinder. Their deaths had bought time, had forced the enemy to bleed for every meter. But they had also exposed the terrifying fragility of the situation. The Guard were not infinite. Their courage was vast, but their bodies were mortal. And once they fell, the Inquisition would no longer be able to justify patience. In this light, the Guard were not merely combatants, they were bargaining chips. Their continued survival made the case for saving the planet. Their extinction would trigger its doom. This is the cruelty of Imperial warcraft. Human lives become strategic arguments. But it would be dishonest to claim that all of the Guard believed in what they were fighting for. Many of them were broken by what they saw. The orcs were one thing, visible, tangible, but chaos is a horror that cannot be unseen. Guardsmen saw their comrades mutated mid-battle, weapons screaming with voices not their own, demonic laughter on every frequency, and some simply stopped following orders, stopped trusting their commanders. Some fled, some turned. And this too pushed the needle toward Exterminatus. Because once discipline begins to crumble, the threat of contagion, ideological, spiritual, or literal, becomes impossible to ignore. It's not just about who is fighting. It's about who still believes they are fighting for the Emperor. The Guard's struggle, then, was not only physical, it was mental, moral, spiritual. Those who endured, who stood against the impossible, who loaded lasgun after lasgun with hands blistered from warp-burned air, they were the truest heroes of Graia. Not genetically enhanced, not trained in the codified perfection of Guilliman's tenets. Just men and women too stubborn to die on schedule. Titus, in his final moments on the surface, carried their legacy. His presence gave form to the hope they had fought for blindly. When he defied Nemeroth, when he rejected the inevitability of corruption, he wasn't just acting as a space marine. He was finishing what the Guard had begun, not because he owed them, but because their deaths had created the only possible path to his victory. And so, the question remains, was their sacrifice enough? Not in the sense of victory, but in the sense of meaning. Did they delay Exterminatus or merely make its arrival more dramatic? The Imperium will never answer that. But what we do know is this: without their courage, there would have been no delay, no hope, no Titus. Only fire. Titan Invictus is not merely a weapon. It is not even a war machine. It is a God made manifest, a walking cathedral of wrath, a monument to humanity's will to dominate the stars through engineered divinity. And on Graia, it stood not as a relic, but as a question mark. Could the Imperium justify obliterating an entire world with such a sacred colossus still intact? Or was even this holy behemoth expendable when the shadow of chaos stretched too far? The Imperator-class Titan is the rarest and most venerated class of God engine in the Imperium's arsenal. These machines are living histories, tens of thousands of years old, imbued with machine spirits so ancient and complex they are more akin to demigods than tools. Their loss is not counted in mere tactical deficit. It is theological devastation. Titan Invictus was not just a weapon of war, it was a shrine. Entire sects of the Adeptus Mechanicus were devoted to its upkeep. Generations of tech priests had been born, served, and died within its hallowed halls. Graia's value was elevated simply by its possession of Titan Invictus. But this was a double-edged blade. If the Titan were to fall into enemy hands, worse, into chaos, then the Imperium would have no choice. Exterminatus would become an act of purification, not punishment. To allow such a relic to be corrupted would be a heresy so profound that even the Lords of Mars might order the world's destruction personally. Thus, Titan Invictus became a linchpin, not just of military power, but of political leverage. As long as it stood, Graia had value. It had symbolic weight, a reason to hesitate, a reason to hope. But this hope was fragile. If the Titan were seen as compromised, or if its plasma reactors showed signs of warp taint, the same symbol of strength could rapidly become the final justification for planetary cleansing. During the siege, the Titan remained eerily silent. Its machine spirit was in stasis, its immense systems locked behind layers of ritual and security. Reactivating such a god engine is no small task. It requires sanctified sequences, liturgical alignment, communion with the Omnissiah. But the possibility remained. If it could be awakened, its mere presence could shift the momentum of the war. One shot from its bellicosa volcano cannon could level a sector of the city. Entire armies could be atomized in the glare of its wrath. And that possibility mattered, because even Inquisitors must weigh their decisions against optics. Destroying a planet that houses an active Imperator-class Titan would not go unnoticed. Questions would be asked, even in whispered conclaves. Had all options truly been exhausted? Had the Titan been consulted? Could its power have turned the tide? These are not idle concerns in the Baroque maze of imperial politics. Titus understood this. His interactions with the Mechanicus were not born solely of military necessity, but of strategic insight. Keeping Titan Invictus intact, even dormant, was a calculated preservation of leverage. Its continued existence as an untainted icon gave pause to those who might have otherwise pushed for orbital annihilation. It wasn't just a war asset, it was a deterrent, but it was also a risk. The Chaos Forces, especially Nemeroth, surely recognized the Titan's potential. Whether they sought to corrupt it, consume it, or use it as a conduit for their rituals, its sacred presence made it a prime target. A corrupted Titan is not just dangerous, it is apocalyptic. The Chaos Titan Dies Irae in the Sabbat World's Crusade was a dark mirror of this threat, and its destruction required an entire campaign. Had Titan Invictus been defiled, the consequences would have been galactic in scale. This threat loomed heavily over every decision made during the siege. Every hour it remained uncontaminated was a victory. Every ward held, every Mechanicus rite successfully performed was a battlefield in its own right. And the spiritual warfare was largely invisible. It was fought not with guns, but with logic cant, sacred oils, and midnight prayers whispered through vox-masked lips. Titus's presence in this environment was a paradox. As a space marine, he respected the Mechanicus, but did not share their rights. Yet his mission aligned with theirs perfectly. To protect the Titan was to preserve a symbol of imperial endurance. And by doing so, he preserved a thread of justification, however thin, for sparing Graia. It's important to note that Exterminatus is not just about destruction. It is about what you are willing to destroy. And when a world contains something like Titan Invictus, that willingness is tested. The loss of such a relic would echo through the fabric of the Imperium. It would be mourned, debated, even investigated. In a galaxy where entire populations are footnotes, the destruction of a god engine becomes a headline. Thus, the Titan stood not as a weapon in the war, but as a silent argument against its own destruction. Its presence whispered a defiant truth: we are still here. And in the cold logic of Imperial command, sometimes that whisper is enough to stay the fire. Nemeroth's ritual was not a battle plan. It was a prophecy written in blood and data. A blueprint for transcendence, drawn with the entrails of faith. When he stood atop the corrupted spires of Graia, it was not as a mere warlord, but as a supplicant to the gods of the warp. And had he succeeded in completing his ascension, the consequences would have unraveled far more than a single planet. Titus, in striking him down, did not just kill a man. He extinguished a beacon meant to summon eternity's end. The process of a Chaos Lord's ascension is not fully understood by Imperial scholars. It is not codified, it is not repeatable. Each path is unique, a blend of ambition, sacrifice, and favor from the dark gods. For Nemeroth, the ritual had been carefully seeded throughout the campaign. The deaths of millions, the saturation of the world with warp energy, the harvesting of fear and despair, all these were components. But the true center of the rite was himself. He was both the conductor and the altar. We must understand what a successful ascension entails. Nemeroth was not simply trying to become more powerful. He was trying to leave behind mortality altogether, to shed his flesh and remake it in the image of the warp. In doing so, he would become a demon prince, an eternal servant of the ruinous powers, one with immense influence over both the material and immaterial realms. His will would have shaped warp storms, his voice would have echoed across demonic sub-realities, and from the core of Graia his domain would have expanded, unchecked. But such transformations are not passive. They reshape the environment. The very moment of ascension rips through reality like a shockwave. The warp spills outward, not merely opening a gate, but rewriting the rules of physics in its wake. Buildings collapse not from force, but from impossible angles. Vox systems scream hymns to forgotten gods. Flesh liquefies and reforms, and the boundary between daemon and man is lost forever. Had Nemeroth achieved this on Graia, the planet would have been consumed within hours. Not through conventional war, but through metaphysical collapse. Every Mechanicus facility would have become a temple of rot. Every Skitarii warrior a twisted marionette of chaos. The sacred foundries would have produced blasphemies of molten steel and screaming servitors. And from this unholy forge, a new warp rift would have grown. One that could not be sealed by force alone. This is the real threat Titus confronted. It was not the swordplay atop the spire. It was the consequences of failure. Had Nemeroth ascended, he would have become the anchor for a chaos incursion the likes of which the sector had never seen. Reinforcements could not have landed. The Imperial Navy would have been forced to quarantine the system. And with Graia lost, the Forge worlds surrounding it would have followed like dominoes, unable to resist the pull of this new warp gravity well. Exterminatus would not have been a choice. It would have been a reaction, an automatic, desperate response to an act of metaphysical terrorism. But even that might not have worked. Because daemon princes are not destroyed by fire alone. Their forms are ephemeral. They transcend the destruction of their hosts. Nemeroth might have escaped even an orbital bombardment, slipping into the warp to bide his time and return stronger. Graia, meanwhile, would remain a cursed world, a new demesne of the dark gods. And here's the terrifying truth. The ritual was nearly complete. The alignments were in place. The sacrifices had been made. The warp engine had begun to pulse in resonance. Nemeroth stood on the very threshold of his rebirth. All that remained was the final moment, the transition, the exaltation. And it was at that exact point, with the ritual converging, that Titus struck. That final battle was not merely dramatic. It was surgical. Titus interrupted the moment of transformation, shattering the connection between Nemeroth and the warp before it could solidify. He destabilized the ritual's momentum. It was a strike not just against a foe, but against the laws of corrupted metaphysics. And in doing so, he severed the line through which the warp would have poured. It's difficult to express how narrow this margin was. The ritual had already begun to reshape reality. Nemeroth's voice echoed in tones no human throat could make. The air was thick with unreality. Time itself seemed to loop and buckle. The Inquisition may never know how close they came to another demon world forming within the Imperium's core. But Titus knew. He felt it, and he acted. This was not a conventional victory. It was a surgical exorcism, a silencing of a would-be god. The implications are staggering, because it proves that even at the edge of damnation, action can pull a world back. It proves that the ritual's end is not inevitable. And most haunting of all, it proves that Graia was nearly lost. Not to war, but to becoming something worse than death. A beacon, a shrine, a birthplace. And now, thanks to Titus, just a scar. The dust settled. The chaos forces were shattered. The orcs, leaderless and in disarray, scattered into the ruins. Graia still stood, cracked but not broken. And yet, the Exterminatus never came. There were no cyclonic torpedoes fired, no searing lance beams from orbit. The world was not erased. But this absence, this non-event, does not mean salvation. It means hesitation, because in the eyes of the Imperium, the rot that lingers may still be fatal. The question no one can answer with certainty is whether Exterminatus was cancelled or merely postponed. This ambiguity is not unusual in the Imperium. The Inquisition rarely clarifies its intentions, and even less so its hesitations. Official records are often contradictory. Box recordings disappear. Planetary fates are decided behind sealed doors. Graia, in the aftermath of the battle, became a ghost world in the bureaucratic machine, a place too important to ignore, too dangerous to trust. And within that liminal space, doom lingers, not as an action, but as a possibility. Inquisitor Thrax did not order Exterminatus at the climax of the battle. That much is known. But what was said afterward? What decisions were made aboard his ship as it broke orbit? What communiques were sent to the Ordo Malleus High Conclave? We do not know. And that is terrifying. Because Exterminatus does not have to be enacted immediately. It can be delayed, it can be prepared, and then held in stasis, ready to be triggered at the first sign of resurgence. The threat that still hovers over Graia is that of residual contamination. Chaos does not die cleanly. It leaves stains that no amount of ritual or fire can erase. A single servo skull corrupted by warp energy could become a vector. A forgotten vault, overlooked in the chaos, might still pulse with forbidden data. A single survivor, tainted in spirit, if not in flesh, might be enough to justify the fire next time. The Imperium has destroyed worlds for less, and so Graia finds itself in a kind of purgatory, technically reclaimed, functionally operable, spiritually condemned. This is not a unique fate. Other worlds have faced similar fates, survived the brink, only to be quietly destroyed decades later, when a new Inquisitor, unburdened by the heroism of the battle, reviewed the data with fresh suspicion. In such cases, there is no warning, no grand announcement, just a sudden silence, followed by fire from the heavens. Graia's strategic value may protect it temporarily. Its manufactoria, once repaired, might be deemed too valuable to lose. The Mechanicus may lobby for preservation, or at least containment rather than destruction. But the Inquisition holds the final authority, and containment is never permanent. It is merely delayed judgment. This delay is where Titus's sacrifice becomes so poignant. He bought time, not absolution. He fought not to erase the threat, but to push it into the future. Perhaps long enough for the world to rebuild. Perhaps not. His actions gave Graia the chance to breathe again. But it breathes under a noose. The existence of inquisitorial quarantine protocols on the planet speaks volumes. Entire sectors remain sealed. Data cores have been isolated and are reviewed under maximum security. No tech priest below Magos rank is permitted to interact with specific areas of the Forge. Graia's skies are watched by sensor arrays linked directly to inquisitorial ships in orbit. At the slightest sign of re-emerging warp activity, those ships may launch their payloads. No further permissions needed. This is the suspended doom of the Imperium. Victory never means peace. It means observation, scrutiny, the waiting judgment of those empowered to destroy what they once fought to save. For the people of Graia, the survivors, the rebuilders, the faithful, this is a spiritual torment. Every prayer they offer is laced with fear. Every Mechanicus rite is performed under the shadow of finality. The forges hum again, but they do so with caution. The bells toll not in triumph, but in defiance of the silence above. Because they know Exterminatus is not forgotten. It is paused. Titus, wherever he is held, cannot know if his efforts were enough. The Inquisition took him for interrogation, perhaps judgment, perhaps study. Perhaps they see in him the same uncertainty they see in the planet. A possibility, a threat, a weapon, or all three. Graia stands today, that is the fact. But it does not live, it survives. And in the Imperium of man, survival is the most tragic form of victory. Because in the silence between stars, doom waits with infinite patience. And one day, it may return, not as war, not as heresy, but as a signature on an order. A torpedo in flight, a final judgment passed not in fury, but in procedure. And the sky will burn. Titus stood at the center of a maelstrom of war, of heresy, of doubt. But it was not the blade or bolter that made his story so singular. It was his defiance of something far more insidious, the warp itself. Where others faltered, he endured. Where others were twisted, he remained whole. And this resilience, rather than being celebrated, became the fulcrum of suspicion. Because in the Imperium, resistance to the warp is not always seen as purity. Sometimes it is seen as proximity. From the moment Titus survived exposure to warp phenomena with no apparent corruption, his fate was sealed. Not as a hero, but as a mystery. And mysteries are dangerous in the Imperium. Astartes are engineered to be resolute, yes, but they are not invincible to chaos. Every chapter has fallen members. Every fortress monastery has tombs of shame. But Titus did not just resist. It barely seemed to affect him. Where others heard whispers, he heard silence. Where others burned with mutation or madness, he remained unchanged. This anomaly drew the eyes of the Inquisition with a clinical hunger. Thrax saw in Titus not proof of faith, but a variable unaccounted for. Was it psychic resistance? Genetic mutation? Hidden heresy? Even the idea that Titus might be blessed by the emperor himself was not enough to save him from suspicion, because the emperor's blessings often come cloaked in fire and silence. There are theories, of course, that Titus carries within him a rare genetic sequence, something unique even among the sons of Guilliman, that he represents a strain of space marine that predates the modern codex structure, a throwback to more primal stock. Others whisper that he may be the result of a hidden experiment by the Mechanicus, an attempt to create a warp-resistant Astartes. If true, it would explain both his endurance and the fear surrounding him. But perhaps the darkest theory is this: that Titus is not immune to the warp, but aligned with it in a way the Imperium cannot understand. Not corrupted, not a servant, but a being who walks the edge, unburned. A gray space between salvation and damnation, a soul too balanced to tip. This theory terrifies the Inquisition, because it implies a future where faith is not enough, where survival depends not on purity, but on adaptability. And in a galaxy governed by dogma, adaptability is heresy. So they took him. Not to praise, not to decorate, but to dissect, figuratively or literally. His fate, post-battle, is left ambiguous in the lore, but the tone is unmistakable. He is in chains, surrounded not by brothers, but by interrogators. His legacy is not one of medals, but of classified reports. And yet, it is this very uncertainty that proves his victory. Because Titus didn't just survive the warp, he prevented its victory. Nemeroth fell, the ritual collapsed, the rift closed. And if Titus carries a piece of the warp within him, then it is a piece denied its voice. He stole from chaos. He denied it its prize. This makes him the most dangerous kind of soldier, one who wins without understanding why, one who walks away from corruption untouched, because he proves that the warp is not all-consuming, that it can be endured, and that idea is more heretical than any demon's whisper. For the Inquisition, Titus represents a philosophical crisis. If he is not corrupted, then perhaps corruption is not absolute. If he is not insane, then perhaps sanity can be maintained in the eye of the storm. And if that is true, then so much of the Imperium's doctrine, its fire, its fear, its purges, becomes unnecessary. That is why Titus's resistance is so feared, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. And success without precedent cannot be permitted to stand unchallenged. In the end, Titus may not be remembered. His deeds may be redacted, buried, or misattributed, but his impact remains. He drew a line in the warp-churned sand and did not move. He stood where others fled, and in doing so, he became not just a shield, but a question, one the Imperium has no answer for. Titus was forged in a crucible not of steel, but of silence. What he truly prevented will never be publicly celebrated. There will be no statues, no hymns, no star systems named in his honor. The Imperium does not reward those who create ambiguity, even through heroism. It rewards obedience, predictability, and neat conclusions. Titus offered none of these. He offered only survival, a jagged, unfinished kind of triumph that cannot be easily fit into a sermon or report. And yet, his act may have changed the course of history. Not in ways visible to most, but in vectors that ripple outward. Subtle shifts in how the warp is studied, new cautions introduced into Mechanicus protocols, unspoken doubts whispered in inquisitorial briefings. Titus introduced a variable, a survivor who should not have survived, a space marine who stood in the breach and emerged untainted, not revered, not condemned, simply questioned. This is the burden he carries. To have seen the worst of the warp, to have fought within its glow, to have breathed its poison, and to know that the victory it cost him will never be fully acknowledged. For every record that mentions him, there are 10 that omit him. For every commander who invokes his name, there is an inquisitor who quietly edits it out of the official archive. And that is what makes his act all the more sacred. Because Titus acted not for glory, not even for duty. He acted out of conviction, a quiet, immovable sense that the Imperium is worth saving, even if it does not save him. He acted as a blade, as a wall, as a refusal made flesh, and by doing so he created something precious in the grimdark universe. A future. Not a bright one, not a peaceful one, but a possible one. This possibility extends beyond Graia. It seeps into the very mindset of those who learn of his deeds, unofficially, anecdotally, in forbidden tales shared in dark corridors. That a single Astartes could prevent a galactic-level catastrophe through will alone is not just inspiring, it is destabilizing. It means the warp is not absolute. It means there are cracks even in the madness. But Titus would reject such reverence. He does not seek to be a symbol. Symbols are fragile. They can be broken, corrupted, weaponized. He seeks only to be ready, to act when needed, to stand where others fall. If the Inquisition allows it, if he is ever released, he will return to the battlefield, not to reclaim his honor, but to fulfill his nature. And if he never returns, then his final legacy will be the silence he earned. A planet still spinning, a Titan still sleeping, a rift still closed, a future still unwritten. And that, in the end, is what he truly prevented. Not merely Exterminatus, but inevitability. He showed that doom could be resisted. That chaos could be confronted without surrender. That a man, even a transhuman one, could hold the line, not in defiance of the Emperor, but in perfect alignment with his unknowable will. That is what Titus gave us. A pause in the scream, a break in the storm, a moment to remember that even in the bleakest darkness, there are those who do not yield. And that, for however long it lasts, is everything. So what did Titus truly prevent? Not just a planetary holocaust, not just the unchecked birth of a daemon prince, not merely the mechanical application of Exterminatus. He stopped the collapse of possibility itself. In the void of the far future, where hope is often a liability and faith is enforced at gunpoint, Titus carved out a flicker of potential. He gave the Imperium a chance, not to change perhaps, but to endure one more day, one more breath. And that might be all it ever gets. The Exterminatus ending that never came was not a conclusion. It was a moment suspended. A gun held aloft, safety off, finger twitching on the trigger. It hangs over Graia still, and perhaps always will. But for now, the shot was not fired. And that restraint, rare and radical in a galaxy addicted to absolutes, was earned by one space marine who did not fit the mold. Titus defied chaos, but he also defied the Imperium's logic. He remained pure without fanfare, victorious without corruption, unshaken by the most insidious forces in existence. His purity did not stem from blind faith, nor from ritual, but from an inner axis so steadfast it denied the warp its due. And that is terrifying to both the enemies of mankind and those who claim to be its protectors. In a universe where fire is the only answer, Titus whispered, no, not because he doubted the threat, but because he had seen it and still chose restraint. He knew that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there is power in holding the line instead of pressing the button. In this way, he may be the most human of all the Astartes. Not in weakness, but in choice. And that is why his story matters. Because in Warhammer 40,000, where stories end in blood, fire, and screams, the tale of Titus ends in a question. What if survival is enough? What if, just this once, the fire does not fall? What if the hero who prevented the end of a world did so not by unleashing holy wrath, but by choosing to believe that damnation is not inevitable? And if you believe that kind of story deserves to be told, to be remembered, and you are part of that refusal, you are part of that pause in the scream. So if this journey into Titus's silent victory resonated with you, if you felt that shadow of doom pass overhead and wondered just for a moment what lies beyond it, then join us. Subscribe to the channel, share this story. Spread the legend not of a god, but of a man who chose to stand. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, that might be the only kind of light we ever get.